This video is brought to you by Devout Decals, makers of reusable Catholic art for your home altar, your bedroom, and your home classroom.
There have been a great many evil things said about Father Malachi Martin. Mostly aired after he passed away, but some during his lifetime. The attacks on him, seemingly out of nowhere, came from various different people who, when you dug into their background even a little bit, were directly connected to the Jesuits in some way or other. Either as people who had zero credibility and were damaged goods, we'll say, would come forward and make the most outlandish and unchristian claims about Malachi Martin's personal behavior, and then they would bring evidence given to them by Jesuits directly. Or you would have attacks leveled against him by Jesuits themselves, and this came seemingly out of nowhere. Until you realize that the timing for all this was directly related to the publishing of this book, The Jesuits, the Society of Jesus and the Betrayal of the Roman Catholic Church. This was published after his novel, Vatican, which I keep telling people to read, but most people just ignore me. But his novel, Vatican, was essentially the precursor to Windswept House. It details the history in detail of all the crises that afflicted the church from the 1940s until the 1980s. With a prologue at the beginning detailing a implication of a deal made with Pope Pius IX and the secular world that would have long-ranging effects on the church. I highly recommend that book. I also highly recommend the one we're going to start going over now, The Jesuits. And this is important to go over because, as you're hearing this excerpt I have for you, what's going on here in the church, and has been, Malachi Martin says the 1960s. I will agree to disagree with him and say that it happened much earlier than that. But this battle in the church he describes as a war waged by the Jesuits on the papacy itself. And here you will begin to see some of the details that really began to emerge in the 1960s. He'll go over later in the book various documents issued by the Vatican and by the Jesuits, the infiltration of the Jesuits into the hierarchy of the Roman Church, all of those things. Here you get the groundwork for the public phase of this, because previously it was all philosophy and theology that was being debated. Desjardins, Loisy, and these other figures were Jesuits, but they predated the conflict in the church by decades. They were the ones the popes were writing a response to. Pius X with Pascendi and others. But he details the public phase of this that began in his estimation in the 1960s. So here, Malachi Martin describing the Jesuits' war against the papacy.
A state of war exists between the papacy and the religious order of the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus, to give the order its official name. That war signals the most lethal change to take place within the ranks of the professional Roman clergy over the last 1,000 years. And as with all important events in the Roman Catholic Church, it involves the interests, the lives, and the destinies of ordinary men and women in the millions. As with so many wars in our time, however, the Jesuits did not declare theirs against the papacy. Indeed, though the first open skirmishes began in the 1960s, it took time for the effects of the war, even very profound effects, to become widely apparent. Because the leaders in the war were the superiors of the order, it was a simple matter to place men of like mind in charge of the organs of power and authority and communication throughout the organization. With that much accomplished, the vast bulk of Jesuits had precious little to say in the extraordinary decisions that followed. In time, there were rumblings and warnings of what was happening. A takeover is taking place, one Jesuit wrote, as he looked aghast at the ease with which the dissolution of the established order in the Society of Jesus is being achieved. By then, however, it was already the early 70s, and the already had been underway for nearly a decade, and such alarms were of little avail. In fact, given the strict obedience of Jesuits, a fabled and time-tested element in the old structure that the new leaders still found useful when dealing with dissenters from their strange and unfamiliar policies, the rank and file of the order were given no alternative but to go along with the changes that, in the words of another Jesuit, wrenched the Society of Jesus from under us and turned it into some monstrous entity under the guise of good goals. Still in all, one might be inclined to ask, suppose there is a problem between the Roman papacy and the Jesuits, how bad can it be? Call it a war if you like, but really, isn't it just another squabble in the Roman Catholic Church? In a world that finds itself teetering on the perpetual brink of annihilation, and in which half the population has no food while most of the other half is pinned in the mud by one sort of injustice or another, how important can some dusty theological argument be? About as important, perhaps, as how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. The fact is, however, it is not a squabble about niceties, nor even a theological falling out between the papacy and Jesuits that involves only scholars, clerics, and the faithful. As both papacy and Jesuits know, the effects of their policies go far beyond the confines of the Roman Catholic Church, even far beyond the nearly 1 billion Catholic men and women around the world. Almost everything that happens in this war bears directly and immediately on the major dissensions that rack every nation and people in the world. It is involved in the very heart of the rivalry between the United States and the Iron Curtain, for example. It bears right now on the fate of misery or happiness of 350 million people in Latin America. It affects the deeply changing public moral code and national consensus of the American people. The imminent preponderance in human affairs of the People's Republic of China, the fragile persistence of a free Western Europe, the security of Israel, the still rickety promise of a viable Africa just aborning. All of these things, separate and unconnected, as they may seem, are not only interwoven with one another, but are and will be profoundly influenced by the tides and outcome of the worldwide collision between the papacy and the Society of Jesus. All wars are about power. In the war between the papacy and the society, power flows along the lines of two fundamental and concrete issues. The first is authority. Who is in command of the worldwide Roman Catholic Church? Who lays down the law as to what Roman Catholics must believe and what sort of morals they must practice? The second issue is purpose. What is the purpose of the Roman Catholic Church in this world? For the papacy, the answers to both questions are clear and well known. Authority to command and to teach descends through its hierarchic structure from pope to bishops to priests to laity, and the sole purpose of the church in this world is to make sure that each individual has the means of reaching the eternal life of God after death. It is an exclusively otherworldly purpose. For many Jesuits, on the other hand, the church's centralized authority, the command structure through which it is exercised, and its purpose are all unacceptable today. The traditional prerogatives of this pope, John Paul II, or of any pope, are objectionable. In place of a hierarchic church, they are aiming at a church composed of small and autonomous communities of people. The people of God, as they are collectively known, or the People's Church, all loosely associated only by faith, but definitely not by one central and centralizing authority such as the papacy claims to be. In place of the otherworldly purpose of the traditional church, the Society of Jesus has substituted the here and now struggle for the liberation of one class of men and women in our society today. Those millions who suffer from social, economic, and political injustice. The way of speaking about that class struggle is an important and delicate matter for the Jesuits. The new mission of the Society, for it is nothing less than that, suddenly places them in actual, and in some instances, willing alliance with Marxists in their class struggle. The aim of both is to establish a socio-political system affecting the economies of nations by a thoroughgoing redistribution of Earth's resources and goods, and in the process to alter the present governmental systems in vogue among nations. It won't do, however, for the Society to come right out and say as much as a matter of corporate policy. That would be to lose the war before the troops are even thoroughly deployed. To cover the same reality, the expression current among Jesuits and others within the Church who are sympathetic to this new mission is a phrase torn from its original context in a document issued in 1968 by a conference of Catholic bishops held in Medellin, Colombia. Quote, "To exercise a preferential option for the poor and the oppressed." None of this is to say that the Society of Jesus at any point became officially Marxist. It did not. Nevertheless, the brute fact is that many Jesuits wish to see a radical change in the democratic capitalism of the West in favor of a socialism that seems inevitably to come up smelling just like a totalitarian communism. And the fact is as well that there is no lack of individual and influential Jesuits who regularly speak up for the new crusade. A brief cameo of three Jesuits, a socio-political scientist, a devoted guerrilla, and a formidable theologian teacher will quickly sketch the wide and all-encompassing arc of the modern Jesuit endeavor to win this war. The first, Arthur F. McGovern, S.J., is an outstanding and convinced apologist for the new Jesuit anti-capitalism. In 1980, he published a book on the subject, Marxism, An American Christian Perspective, and he has made his mind clear on many occasions. Essentially, McGovern says that Marxism was and is a social critique, pure and simple. Marx just wanted to get us to think more clearly about the means of production, how people produce, and about the means of distribution, the people who own and control the means of production. In all this, Marxism cannot be written off as, quote, untrue. It was Engels and Lenin who added the disgusting ingredients of scientific materialism and atheism. You have only to read the unpublished writings of the young Marx to become aware of his more humanistic side. Consequently, McGovern concludes, we must isolate Marx's social critique, which is true, from those foreign elements. We can accept Marx's concept of class struggle, because there is a class struggle. This does mean revolution, but, quote, revolution does not clearly mean violence. It means we have to have a new kind of society. Definitely not democratic capitalism as we know it. McGovern sees in Jesus, as portrayed in St. Luke's Gospel, a paragon of revolution. St. Luke's is a, quote, social gospel, he says, quoting Jesus in support of his cause. Quote, I have come to preach the good news to the poor, to set the downtrodden free, to redeem captives. See, McGovern adds, how many times Jesus speaks about poverty, identifies with poor people, criticizes people who lay burdens on the poor. Clearly, therefore, Jesus acknowledged the class struggle and endorsed the revolution. Consciously or unconsciously, like most modern Jesuits and many Catholic activists, McGovern has effectively laid aside 1,400 years of rich Catholic, authentically Christian interpretation of the Bible. He has reinterpreted the gospel and the salvific mission of the Son of God in an economic sense, a this-worldly sense, a non-supernatural sense, an un-Catholic sense. All the rest follows. Because the new kind of society cannot be democratic capitalism as we know it, the United States as the leader and most successful exponent of democratic capitalism comes center stage. Indeed, as early as in the war as the 1960s, when Jesuits in the United States established a, quote, Jesuit National Leadership Project, their working paper was explicit about the intention to change the fundamental structure of America from that of capitalist democracy. Quote, we as Jesuits must recognize that we participate in many sinful structures of American society. Hence, we run the risk of sin unless we work to change that. End quote. As one swallow does not make a summer, so one McGovern, or even one Jesuit National Leadership Project, does not make a war. Its stated policy aside, in every practical sense, the Society of Jesus is committed corporately to this class struggle. Its message comes today from 1,000 different sources among clergymen and theologians living in the countries of democratic capitalism. It is enshrined in a totally new theology, the theology of liberation, whose handbook was written by a Peruvian Jesuit, Father Gustavo Gutierrez, and whose Hall of Fame includes a remarkable number of prominent Latin American Jesuits, such as John Sobrino, Juan Luis Segundo, and Fernando Cardenal. Those are not household names heard on the mighty news in the USA. They are, however, men of significant international influence for the Americas and for Europe. Though the movement has been worldwide since its inception, it was above all in Latin America that the strange alliance between Jesuits and Marxists gathered its first practical momentum. It was there that this new Jesuit mission, entailing as it does nothing less than the transformation of the socio-political face of the West, first entangled lives far more profoundly than McGovern and theoreticians like him anticipated. Quickly, scores of Jesuits began to work with the passion and zeal that has always been so typical of them, for the success of the Sando-communists in Nicaragua, and when the Sandinistas took power, those same Jesuits entered crucial posts in the central government and attracted others to join at various regional levels. In other Central American countries, meanwhile, Jesuits not only participated in guerrilla training of Marxist cadres, but some became guerrilla types themselves, inspired by the idealism they saw in liberation theology, and encouraged by the independence inherent in the new idea of the Church as a group of autonomous communities. Jesuits found all was permitted, even encouraged, as long as it furthered the concept of the new People's Church. Such men were the dream and ideal of the true liberation theologians, for they were the fighters, the cadres who took liberation theology from theory to what they called praxis, the implementation of the people's revolution for economic and political liberation. From that praxis, the liberation theologians insisted, from below among the people, would come all true theology to replace the old theology once imposed autocratically from above by the hierarchy of the Roman Church. The second name on that arc of the new Jesuit endeavor is James Francis Carney, S.J., a man who was the paragon of praxis, perhaps the most thoroughgoing, if not the most famous or influential of all modern Jesuit liberation theologians. Carney was Chicago born and bred. He trained as a Jesuit in the Chicago province. At the end of his Jesuit training, he volunteered for work in Central America and was sent there in 1961. He was so taken by a stint there that he became a Honduran citizen. Over the years, Carney drank in liberation theology like rare wine. He became known as a champion of the poor and an acerbic, unrelenting, unmerciful critic of the governments and established armies, particularly in Honduras. His name and activities were publicly associated with the jungle-based fighters. Even when a price was laid on his head by Honduran army authorities, there was no move by Jesuit superiors to curb Carney's military associations. Indeed, Carney was only one of several Jesuits in Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Costa Rica, who were all pursuing the same course with the blessing of their local and Roman superiors. Sitting happily in a ramshackle dirt-floor champa in the Nicaraguan town of Limay, where he had sought temporary refuge from the military conflict in Honduras, the 47-year-old Jesuit priest finished writing his autobiography by candlelight. It was March 6, 1971. By that time, Carney had already behind him 10 years of hardship and labor in Central America, and he had some 12 more years to live. Padre Lupe, as his Indians called him affectionately, it was short for Guadalupe, told the world how he had derived the three mainstays or basic truths of liberation theology from the writings of fellow Jesuit Juan Luis Segundo. It makes for bleak, saddening reading. Segundo's Grace in the Human Condition showed Carney that, quote, everything is supernatural in this world. Segundo's The Sacraments Today revealed to Padre Lupe that, quote, humanity is evolving a more correct idea of God. And Segundo's Evolution and Guilt taught him that, quote, the revolutionary dialect has to overcome the sin of conservatism of the church. With the saddest of loves, Lupe had already written to his family in the United States to tell them what he was going to do. The letter is reproduced in his autobiography. He had to share the revolution with his beloved Honduran campesinos because he wrote, quote, I cannot stand living with all of you in your way of life. Capitalism, he said, in whose sin all Americans were immersed, was just as heinous and evil as the hammer and sickle was supposed to be. Only the removal of that system could eradicate capitalism and transnational imperialism from Central America. To be a Christian is to be a revolutionary. We Christian Marxists will have to fight side by side in Central America with the Marxists who do not believe in God in order to form a new socialist society, a pure Central American model. Drunk on the ignorance Latin idealism of liberation theologians, this Jesuit came to the belief that, quote, a Marxist is not dogmatic, but is dialectical. A Christian does not dogmatically condemn anyone, but respects the beliefs of others. A dogmatic anti-communist Christian is not a real Christian, and a dogmatic anti-Christian Marxist is not a real Marxist. Having invested the hard reality of Marxism as it has been known historically with an airy magic based on no three-dimensional reality, Carney sketched for his family his pure Central American model. Neither communist nor capitalist, the new socialism will be, quote, a brotherhood and sisterhood of all humanity, and equally a classless society. Theologically speaking, quote, the universe of man is in a dialectical evolution towards the kingdom of God. Even though everyone, quote, respects the beliefs of others, Carney was able to be far more honest and McGovern in recognizing that, quote, dialectical means conflictive, advanced by a series of struggles between people of contradictory ideologies. In fact, Carney had become convinced that the very purpose of the dialectic of struggle was to overcome the sin of conservatism that is the peculiar sin of the Roman Catholic Church. God's very plan for the evolution of the world and of human society would unfold in conflict and military encounter. The change thus brought about would be complete. It would be at one and the same time a, quote, cultural, spiritual change and an economic, social, political change as well. Carney ended his autobiography with a plea to all Christians. Get rid of any unfair and unchristian prejudices you have against military solution, socialism, Marxism, and the hammer and sickle. There's no third way between being a Christian and being a revolutionary. This was the ultimate plea for praxis. Later, that spring of 1971, with the agreement of his superiors, Carney illicitly returned to Honduras to share the stories of bravado of his illicit military life. It was the beginning of 12 years of telling of this praxis from the dialectical conflict he treasured as the key to the future of Catholicism. In agreement with his provincial superior, Father Jerez, who was under some pressure by then from Rome and the Vatican, Father Carney finally resigned from the Jesuits. The understanding he had with Jerez and his superiors was that he could rejoin the society once the struggle was over. The society, after all, was merely a convenience. In a world where everything was already supernatural, as Padre Lupe wrote that it was for him, there was no room for any hard and fast rules, no room for an infallibly authoritative Roman Church. There was no need for any church to sanctify anything because all was supernatural and therefore holy already. The Church was just another part of humanity, on a par with humanity in relation to God, learning as humanity learns, moving with humanity towards the utopia on earth. It pains me, Carney wrote, but I want to be honest and not hurt the Jesuits by joining the forces as a disobedient fugitive from the society, forcing them to expel me. As others who came after him have shown, Carney needn't have worried about disobedience or expulsion. Still, if Father Lupe had not preserved the rudiments of his Roman Catholic faith, he'd at least preserve his candor and his ability to make a clear choice. In September 1983, Carney's 90-man unit was eliminated in a conflict with the Honduran forces of his longtime enemy, General Gustavo Alvarez Martinez, whom he had often denounced in public. A few of his men who survived were captured and thrown into a rectangular pit in the jungle behind the Honduran military camp of Nueva Palestina. Was Carney one of those men? No one has ever been able to find out. Is he alive? In all likelihood. From exhaustion? At least from exhaustion. Was he interrogated? Probably. Harmed? Probably. Was he denied food? Probably. Is he still alive and a prisoner somewhere in the jungle? That does not seem possible, but no definitive news has ever been revealed.
That's the kind of war this is. It's not even remotely about the number of angels who can dance on the head of the pin. It's a war in which life is ended regularly and in great quantities. Priests like Carney are not rare exceptions. Surely they don't all write testaments of their conversion to revolutionary means for the world to read, and not all go so far as to live among the forces who engage in it. But in the many and varied roles they do play in the world's purely political arena, men such as Father Carney, S.J., each and every one of them are essential to the success of the Jesuits in the war against the papacy. And having heard all that, how much of what you hear there brings to mind Pope Francis, the world's first Jesuit pope? Probably the last Jesuit pope, at least for a long time, simply because the chaos he's wrought on the church, even his allies, are decrying. But how much of that rings true for him? Do you see how you get from what he describes in that book to where we are today? Well, don't worry if you haven't, because I will be helping to fill the blanks in for you as we continue looking at Malachi Martin and the Jesuits in the near future. But let me know what you thought of this in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. This certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.